The brass latch on her mother's trunk clicked shut with a finality that echoed through the empty room. Sarah Elwood straightened her back, wiping dust from her hands onto her plain brown skirt. At 23, she stood taller than most women in Lawrence. Kansas, a fact that had been pointed out to her more times than she cared to count. "You sure about this?" "Sarah." Her younger sister Mary stood in the doorway, her delicate frame a stark contrast to Sarah's sturdy build. "California's awful far." "Not California," Sarah corrected, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "Colorado territory. Uncle Josiah left me his homestead near Timberline. It's mine now, legal and proper." Mary's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back all morning. "But after what Thomas said?" "Don't!" Sarah's voice came out sharper than intended. She softened it. "Thomas Wellington made his choice. I won't be the woman who waits around hoping he'll change his mind." 3 weeks had passed since Thomas had taken back his proposal in the parlor of her father's house. His words still rang in her ears. "I need a wife who'll look proper beside me. Sarah, you're a fine woman. But when we walk together, folks stare. A man in my position can't have people whispering about his wife being more suited to farm work than society tease." Sarah had stood there, her height suddenly feeling like a burden, her strong hands that could birth a calf or mend a fence seeming crude and unwomanly. She'd simply nodded, handed him back his ring, and walked out with her chin high. But that night, she'd cried into her pillow until the cotton was soaked through. "The stage leaves in an hour," Sarah said, hefting the trunk. Mary rushed to help, but Sarah waved her off. "I can manage." Outside, the October air bit with the promise of early winter. Their father waited by the wagon, his weathered face grim. "Your mother would have talked sense into you," he said. "Mother would have understood," Sarah replied, loading her belongings. Besides the trunk, she had 2 carpet bags, her mother's Bible, and a leather satchel containing the deed to Uncle Josiah's land and the map he'd sent her 2 Christmases ago. The ride to the stage depot passed in uncomfortable silence. Sarah watched the familiar streets of Lawrence roll by Mrs. Henderson's boarding house where she'd taught piano to earn extra money, the church where she'd imagined marrying Thomas, the mercantile where people still whispered about the Elwood girl who scared off her beau. At the depot, a small crowd had gathered. The westbound stage was already loading. Sarah recognized several faces neighbors who'd come to gawk rather than wish her well. She kept her eyes forward, focusing on the driver securing luggage atop the coach. "That's everything, Miss," the driver, a grizzled man with kind eyes, took her trunk, heading far. "Timberline, Colorado territory." He whistled low. "That's rough country. You got folks there?" "Land," Sarah said simply. "My land." Something in her tone made him nod respectfully. "Well then, climb aboard. We'll get you there." Sarah turned to her family. Mary threw her arms around her waist, sobbing openly now. Their father stood stiff, but when Sarah met his eyes, she saw his struggle. "Right when you're settled," he said gruffly. "And if things don't work out, they will." Sarah kissed his cheek, tasting the salt of her own tears. "They have to." She climbed into the stage, her height requiring her to duck low. Inside, 3 other passengers had already claimed seats: a merchant with pomaded hair, a woman in widow's weeds, and a young man who looked barely old enough to shave. They shifted to make room, the widow pulling her skirts aside with a pinched expression. As the stage lurched into motion, Sarah caught one last glimpse of her family through the window. Mary waved frantically while their father stood with one arm around her shoulders. Then the depot fell away, replaced by the endless grass of the prairie. "First time heading west?" the young man asked eagerly. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice yet. "Me too. Name's Peter Hartwell. I'm going to Denver to work for my uncle's newspaper. They say there's fortunes to be made out there." "I'm not looking for a fortune," Sarah said quietly. "Just a place where being myself isn't a disappointment to anyone." The widow made a small sound that might have been sympathy or disapproval. The merchant had already dozed off, his head lolling with each bump in the road. Sarah pulled out Uncle Josiah's map, studying it though she'd memorized every line. His letter was folded inside. She knew those words by heart, too. "The land ain't pretty, niece, but it's honest. Out here, the mountains don't care if you're tall or short, refined or rough. They only care if you're strong enough to last." As the afternoon wore on, the landscape began to change. The neat farms gave way to wilder country. Sarah had never been further than Kansas City, and each mile took her deeper into the unknown. Yet, with each turn of the wheels, she felt something loosening in her chest, the tight knot of shame and hurt that had lodged there since Thomas's rejection. Peter chattered about his plans. The widow dozed, and the merchant snored. Sarah watched the sun sink lower, painting the grasslands gold and amber. Somewhere ahead lay the Rocky Mountains, and at their feet, a piece of land with her name on it. It wasn't much 160 acres Uncle Josiah had claimed under the Homestead Act, but it was hers. The stage stopped at a way station as darkness fell. Sarah climbed out, stretching muscles cramped from hours of sitting. The station was rough-hewn logs and sod, with smoke rising from a chimney. Inside, a woman with work-worn hands served stew and cornbread. Sarah ate hungrily, ignoring the merchant's comments about the crude accommodations. "You traveling alone, miss?" the station keeper's wife asked, refilling Sarah's coffee. "Yes, ma'am." The woman studied her with sharp but not unkind eyes. "That takes courage, or desperation. Which is it for you?" Sarah considered the question. "Maybe both. My uncle left me land near Timberline. I aim to make something of it. Josiah Elwood's niece, I heard about his passing. Good man, your uncle. Bit peculiar, living out there alone all those years, but good." She leaned closer. "That's hard country for a woman alone. You might want to think about finding yourself a husband quick-like." Sarah's jaw tightened. "I tried that route. Turns out I'm not the marrying kind." The woman surprised her by laughing. "Said the same thing myself once. Been married to that ornery cuss for 20 years now." She patted Sarah's shoulder. "You'll do fine, girl. You got the look of someone who don't break easy." Back in the stage, Sarah wrapped herself in her shawl and tried to sleep, but her mind kept turning to what lay ahead. She'd never lived alone, never run a household without her mother's guidance. The skills she had, the very ones Thomas had found so unbecoming, would have to be enough. As the stage rolled through the darkness, Sarah fingered the worn leather of Uncle Josiah's map. Tomorrow they'd reach the foothills. In 3 days, maybe 4 if weather turned. She'd stand on her own land. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She thought of Thomas, probably courting some petite blonde who'd never embarrass him at social gatherings. Let him have his proper wife. Sarah was heading toward something different, a life where her strong hands would be an asset, where her height might help her see danger coming across the plains, where she could be herself without apology. The stage hit a rough patch, jolting everyone awake. Through the window, Sarah caught a glimpse of stars, more than she'd ever seen in Kansas, scattered across the sky like spilled silver. Somewhere under those stars lay her future, uncertain but her own. She closed her eyes and let the rocking of the stage carry her toward morning, toward mountains, toward a new beginning that asked nothing of her but courage and determination. Those, at least, she had in abundance. The first flakes began falling as they crossed into Colorado territory. Sarah pressed her face to the stage window, watching the snow drift down like feathers from a torn pillow. The merchant across from her grumbled about the weather, while Peter Hartwell's excitement had given way to green-faced misery from the constant swaying. "Storm's coming," the widow said, speaking for the first time in hours. Her name was Mrs. Blackwood. Sarah had learned at the last station, "Feel it in my bones." By afternoon, the snow had thickened into a white curtain that obscured everything beyond a few feet. The stage slowed to a crawl, wheels grinding through deepening drifts. Sarah could hear the driver shouting to the horses, his voice barely audible above the wind's howl. Inside the coach, breath fogged the windows. Sarah wiped a clear spot with her sleeve, trying to see landmarks that might tell her how close they were to timberline. According to her calculations, they should arrive by nightfall, but that was before the storm. The stage lurched suddenly, tilting at a dangerous angle. "Misses!" Blackwood gasped. Grabbing for the leather strap, Peter tumbled across the cabin, landing hard against Sarah's knees. The merchant cursed colorfully as his luggage tumbled from the overhead rack. "Everyone all right in there?" The driver's face appeared at the window, snow clinging to his beard. "Wheels stuck in a drift. Gonna need to dig out." Sarah didn't hesitate. "I'll help." "Miss, that ain't necessary." But she was already climbing out, her boots sinking into snow that reached her shins. The wind hit like a physical blow, driving ice crystals into her face. She pulled her shawl up over her head and moved to where the driver was examining the trapped wheel. Together they dug, using a shovel from the stage box in their hands when needed. Sarah's skirts quickly became soaked and heavy, but she'd worked in worse conditions during Kansas blizzards. Her height gave her leverage the driver lacked, and between them, they freed the wheel. "You're a godsend, Miss," the driver said, helping her back into the stage. "Most ladies would have stayed put." "I'm not most ladies," Sarah replied, wringing snow from her hem. They pressed on, but progress was agonizingly slow. The storm worsened with each mile. Sarah could no longer see anything through the windows but white. The stage rocked and pitched like a boat in rough seas. Then, without warning, they stopped. The driver climbed down and returned with grim news. "Can't see the road anymore. We push on. We're liable to go over a cliff or get lost complete. There's a way station about a mile back. We passed it thinking to make timberline tonight. We'll have to turn around." The prospect of backtracking through the storm sent Peter into fresh despair. But Sarah felt only frustration. So close to her destination, yet forced to retreat. Still, she'd rather be delayed than dead at the bottom of a ravine. The mile back to the station felt like 10. Twice more the stage bogged down, requiring all passengers except Mrs. Blackwood to get out and push. By the time they glimpsed the station's lights through the snow, Sarah was soaked through and shivering violently. The station was larger than the previous ones, built to withstand mountain winters. The keeper, a barrel-chested man named Hoffman, helped them inside while his sons tended to the exhausted horses. "You're lucky," Hoffman said, stoking the fire in the main room. "2 stages got caught out last winter, found 'em come spring, froze solid." Sarah huddled near the flames, teeth chattering. Mrs. Hoffman, a tiny woman who moved with quick efficiency, brought blankets and hot coffee laced with whiskey. "Rooms are full up," she announced. "You ladies can share the small room off the kitchen. Gentlemen, you'll have to make do with bedrolls by the fire." Sarah didn't care about propriety or comfort. She was simply grateful to be alive and gradually warming. She helped Mrs. Hoffman serve a simple meal of beans and salt pork while the storm raged outside. "How long do these storms usually last?" she asked. Mrs. Hoffman shrugged. "Could blow out by morning. Could last 3 days. Mountain weather does what it pleases." After supper, Sarah found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and returned to the main room, where embers still glowed in the fireplace. To her surprise, she found the driver there, nursing a pipe. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. Settling into a chair, "I keep thinking how close I am. Timberline can't be more than 20 miles. "You got grit, Miss. Saw that today, but 20 miles in this weather might as well be 100. He studied her through the pipe smoke. "What's waiting for you in Timberline that's worth risking this kind of journey?" "A new life," Sarah said simply. "Or at least the chance at one." The driver nodded slowly. "Running from something or towards something?" "Both, I suppose." Sarah stared into the dying fire.
Have you been to Timberline?
Many times. It's a rough town. Miss mining camps and cattle outfits. Not many women. And those there are. He trailed off delicately.
I'm not looking for society teas,
Sarah said dryly.
My uncle left me land outside town. I plan to work it.
The driver's eyebrows rose. You're Josiah Elwood's niece. Well, that explains the grit. Your uncle was tougher than boot leather. Had to be, living out there alone. He paused. You know the place has been empty since he died, almost a year now. Sarah's stomach tightened.
Empty, yes, but it's still mine. The deed is legal.
Oh, I don't doubt that. Just saying. An empty homestead in this country. Well, nature and varmints have a way of moving in when people move out. They sat in companionable silence while the wind howled around the station walls. Sarah thought about her warm bed in Kansas, her sister's gentle presence, her father's gruff protection. All of that was behind her now, as surely as if an ocean separated them instead of mere miles of prairie and mountain. You ever think about turning back? The driver asked quietly. Sarah pulled the blanket tighter.
Every mile since we left Kansas, but there's nothing there for me anymore. I don't fit in that world.
And you think you'll fit here? She met his eyes steadily.
I think here, it won't matter if I fit.
The land won't care that I'm too tall or too strong or too plain-spoken. It'll only care if I work hard enough to survive. The driver knocked his pipe against the hearth.
That's the truest thing I've heard in a while.
This country's got no use for pretense. It'll test you hard, but if you prove yourself, it'll accept you as you are. He stood to go, then paused. When this storm breaks, I'll get you to Timberline. That's a promise. Sarah nodded her thanks and remained by the fire a while longer. Through the window, she could see nothing but swirling white, as if the whole world had been erased. Somewhere beyond that white curtain lay her uncle's homestead. Her homestead now. She tried to picture it from his letters, a cabin of pine logs, a small barn, a spring that never ran dry even in drought years. He'd written of deer that came to drink at dawn, of eagles circling the peaks, of silence so deep you could hear your own heartbeat. The storm continued through the night and all the next day. Sarah helped Mrs. Hoffman with chores, mended a tear in Peter's coat, and played cards with the other passengers. But her mind kept drifting to what awaited her. On the second night, she woke to stillness. The constant howl of wind had ceased. She crept to the window and gasped. The storm had passed, leaving a world transformed. Snow blanketed everything in pristine white, glowing blue in the moonlight. Stars sparkled overhead with impossible brightness, and in the distance, she could see the dark shapes of mountains rising like sleeping giants. Beautiful, ain't it, Mrs.? Hoffman had joined her at the window. This country shows you both faces, the one that wants to kill you and the one that takes your breath away, sometimes both in the same day. At first light, the men dug out the stage. The driver was true to his word. As soon as the horses were hitched, they were moving again, following the road that had been invisible just days before. The journey to Timberline took most of the day, wheels crunching through fresh snow. Sarah's anticipation grew with each mile. When buildings finally appeared on the horizon, her heart began to race. Timberline was exactly as rough as the driver had warned. The main street was a muddy track between false-fronted buildings. Signs advertised assay offices, saloons, and supplies. Men in heavy coats trudged along boardwalks, and the few women Sarah glimpsed hurried past with downcast eyes. The stage stopped before a building marked Timberline Hotel and Stage Office. Sarah climbed down on shaking legs, her breath clouding in the cold air. This was it, the end of one journey and the beginning of another. She collected her trunk and bags, looking around for someone who might direct her to her uncle's property. The other passengers dispersed quickly. Peter to find lodging. Mrs. Blackwood met by a younger woman who must be her daughter. The merchant already haggling with someone about freight charges. Need help, miss? A man in a sheriff's badge approached. his expression professionally courteous. "I'm looking for the Elwood homestead," Sarah said. "I'm Josiah Elwood's niece. He left me the property." The sheriff's face changed, sympathy replacing courtesy. "I'm sorry for your loss. Miss, your uncle was a good man, but I have to tell you that place has been sitting empty for months. Last I heard, a grizzly had taken up residence in the barn." Sarah's heart sank, but she kept her voice steady. "Then I'll need to evict him. Can you direct me to the property?" The sheriff studied her with new interest. "It's 5 miles north, along Miller's Creek. But, miss, you can't mean to go there alone. Not with night coming on and the place in the state it's in." Sarah looked at the darkening sky, then back at the sheriff. Everything in her wanted to push forward, to see her land, to begin her new life immediately. But she'd learned something about this country in the past days. It demanded respect for its dangers. "You're right," she said reluctantly. "Is there somewhere I can stay tonight? I'll need to hire help in the morning." "The hotel's decent enough. Mrs. Chen runs a clean place." He tipped his hat. "Welcome to Timberline, Miss Elwood. Your uncle would be glad to know his land's going to family." As Sarah entered the hotel, she paused to look back at the mountains looming over the town. Somewhere among those peaks and valleys lay her future. The storm had delayed her, tested her, shown her a glimpse of what this new life would demand. But she was here now, and tomorrow she would claim what was hers. The wind picked up again, driving snow devils down the empty street. Sarah shivered and went inside, where warmth and temporary shelter awaited. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight, it was enough to have survived the journey. The morning sun cast long shadows across Timberline's muddy main street as Sarah stood outside the hotel, her breath misting in the cold air. She'd spent a restless night planning her next move, and now faced the reality of her situation. She needed supplies and help to reach her property, but her funds were limited. Mrs. Chen had been kind enough to provide directions to the general store and suggest she speak with Sam Morrison, who sometimes hired out his wagon. Sarah picked her way carefully along the boardwalk, trying to keep her skirts from the worst of the mud. The store was cramped and dim, packed floor to ceiling with everything from mining equipment to fabric bolts. Behind the counter stood a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose. "Help you, miss. I need basic supplies," Sarah said, consulting her carefully written list. "Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition for a Springfield rifle." "Hold on there." A deep voice interrupted from behind her. "You even know how to use a Springfield." Sarah turned to find a man loading supplies onto the counter. He was tall, one of the few men she'd met who stood taller than her, with broad shoulders that strained his buckskin jacket. Dark hair hung past his collar, and his face bore the weathered look of someone who spent more time outdoors than in. What struck her most were his eyes gray as winter storm clouds and just as unreadable. "I know how to shoot," she said coolly. "My uncle taught me." The man's expression didn't change. "Your uncle being Josiah Elwood." Now his eyes sharpened with interest. "You're the niece from Kansas. Heard you were coming to claim the place." "News travels fast. Not much else to talk about in winter." He turned back to the shopkeeper. "Add a box of .45, 70 to my order. Morrison. And throw in some of that penny candy. The boys have been working hard." Sarah watched him count out payment, noting the easy way he handled the transactions, the respect the shopkeeper showed him. This was someone established here, someone who belonged. "If you're heading out to Josiah's place, you'll need more than ammunition," the man said without looking at her. "That roof was already going bad last winter. After a year empty," he shrugged. "I appreciate the concern, Mr. Brannon. Luke Brannon. I run cattle about 10 miles west of your uncle's place." Sarah filed the information away. A neighbor. Then, though 10 miles hardly seemed neighborly by Kansas standards. "Well, Mr. Brannon, I'm sure I'll manage." He finally looked at her again, a thorough assessment that made her spine stiffen. She was used to people looking at her height, her plain features, her work-worn hands. But something in his gaze was different, calculating rather than dismissive. "Morrison," he said to the shopkeeper. "She'll need tar paper for that roof, nails, probably new hinges for the door. The place has been sitting empty except for whatever creatures moved in."
"I can make my own list," Sarah said sharply.
"Can you?" He faced her fully now. "You know what a mountain winter does to an empty cabin. You know what supplies you'll need to last until spring melt. You even know how to get there. Roads likely drifted shut by now." Heat rose in her cheeks.
"As I said, I'll manage."
Like Josiah managed. His voice softened slightly. "Found him frozen in his bed last January. Chimney got blocked with snow. Fire went out. Tough as he was. The cold got him in the end." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Uncle Josiah's letters had stopped abruptly, and the lawyer's notification had been sparse on details. She'd assumed his heart had given out, or perhaps a fall, but freezing to death. Alone.
"I didn't know,"
she said quietly. Brannon studied her for a long moment. Then he turned to Morrison. "Put her supplies on my account. I'll settle up next time I'm in town."
"I don't need charity,"
Sarah protested. "Not offering any. Your uncle helped me out when I first came here. I'm paying back a debt." He gathered his supplies, hefting heavy sacks as if they weighed nothing. "Besides, you won't make it to spring on pride alone." He was at the door before Sarah found her voice. "Mr. Brannon, how do I get to the property if the road is drifted?" He paused without turning. "Can't. Not by wagon. On horseback. Maybe, if you know the landmarks." Finally, he looked back. "I'm heading that general direction. You can follow if you've got a horse. If not," he shrugged again. That gesture that seemed to encompass all the harsh realities of this country. "I need to hire a horse. Jed's livery, end of the street. Tell him I sent you might keep him from selling you some broken-down nag." He shifted his load. "I leave in an hour. You're not ready by then. You're on your own." After he left, Sarah stood frozen for a moment. Morrison cleared his throat. "Don't mind Luke. He comes across rough, but he's good people. If he's offering help, you'd best take it." Sarah nodded and quickly completed her purchases, her mind racing. She'd budgeted carefully for supplies, but hadn't counted on needing a horse so soon. Still, what choice did she have? The livery stable smelled of hay and horses, achingly familiar. The proprietor, Jed, was a small man with bandy legs who looked her up and down skeptically. "You're wanting to buy or rent?" "Rent, for now," though Sarah knew she'd need her own horse eventually. "Brannon sent you?" At her nod, his expression grew slightly less suspicious. "Well, let's see what might suit." He showed her several horses, but Sarah's eye was drawn to a mare in the back stall, a sturdy bay with intelligent eyes and good legs. Not pretty, but built for mountain work. "That's Biscuit. She ain't much for looks, but she's steady. Won't spook at shadows or dump you in a creek." "She's perfect." Sarah ran her hand along the mare's neck, feeling the animal's calm strength. "How much?" When he named the price for a week's rental, Sarah winced, but agreed. Her funds were dwindling faster than anticipated, but reaching her property had to be the priority. She returned to the hotel for her belonging, changed into her most practical dress and the men's boots she'd hidden at the bottom of her trunk, a scandalous choice. But side saddle through mountain snow seemed foolish. "Mrs." Chen helped her secure her bags to the saddle. "You be careful out there," the older woman said. "This country's beautiful, but it's unforgiving of mistakes." Sarah found Brannon at the edge of town, his own horse loaded with supplies and a pack mule tied behind. He took in her practical attire without comment, though she thought she saw approval in his glance. "Can you actually ride? Or was that more Kansas talk?" For answer, Sarah swung into the saddle with practiced ease. Biscuit shifted slightly, then settled as Sarah gathered the reins with steady hands. "I've been riding since I could walk. Mr. Brannon, lead on." They rode in silence through the outskirts of town, past the last scattered buildings and into the wilderness proper. The trail wound upward through stands of pine and aspen, the snow deeper here where the sun rarely penetrated. Sarah had to concentrate on following Brannon's path, watching how he guided his horse around obstacles she might have missed. After an hour of steady climbing, he finally spoke. "Your uncle ever tell you why he came out here?"
He said he wanted space to breathe, room to be himself without folks passing judgment.
Brannon made a sound that might have been understanding. "That's why a lot of us are here. Place doesn't care who you were before, only who you are now." He glanced back at her. "Course, that goes both ways. No one here's going to coddle you because you're a woman. You'll stand or fall on your own merit."
"Good,"
Sarah said firmly.
"That's all I want, a fair chance."
They rode on, the trail growing rougher. Twice they had to dismount and lead the horses through drifts. Sarah's skirts, even hiked up as they were, became soaked and heavy. Her hands grew numb inside her gloves. But she didn't complain, sensing this was some sort of test. The sun was high when Brannon called a halt beside a frozen creek. He built a small fire with efficient movements while Sarah tended the horses. When she returned to the fire, he handed her a cup of coffee from a battered pot.
"Thank you,"
she said, grateful for the warmth. He studied her over his own cup.
"You're not what I expected."
"What did you expect?" "Some fainting city girl who'd take one look at these mountains and run back to Kansas." He added more wood to the fire. "Josiah used to talk about his family back east. Said he had a niece who was worth 10 of most men. Figured it was just an old man's bragging." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected connection to her uncle. "He wrote about you too. Said you were the only neighbor worth knowing, even if you were too stubborn for your own good." That drew a slight smile, the first she'd seen from him. It transformed his harsh features, making him look younger, less forbidding. "Sounds like Josiah." The smile faded. "I should have checked on him more that last winter. Kept meaning to ride over, but my own troubles kept me busy. Found him too late." "You found him?" Brannon nodded, staring into the fire. "Went to see why smoke hadn't been coming from his chimney. He was in his bed, looking peaceful enough, like he just went to sleep and didn't wake up. I buried him on the hill behind the cabin, where he liked to watch the sunrise." They sat in silence for a moment, sharing grief for a man who'd meant something to both of them. Finally, Brannon doused the fire and stood. "We should move. Want to reach your place before dark, and we still have to stop at my ranch for tools." "Your ranch? You don't think I'm letting you tackle that cabin alone, do you? I know these mountains. A woman alone in a damaged cabin with night coming on is asking for trouble. My men and I will help get the place livable. You can pay me back come spring if your pride demands it." Sarah wanted to refuse, to insist she could manage alone, but the morning had taught her valuable lessons about the difference between independence and foolishness. "I accept," she said simply. "And thank you." He swung back into the saddle. "Don't thank me yet. Wait till you see what a year of abandonment has done to the place. You might be cursing my name for not talking you out of this fool notion." They rode on through the afternoon, the landscape growing wilder with each mile. Sarah began to understand just how isolated her new home would be. No neighboring farms just across the field. No church bells on Sunday morning. No casual visits from friends. Just mountains and sky, and the kind of silence that could drive a person mad if they weren't suited to it. But as they crested a ridge and she saw the valley spread below her valley, her land, Sarah felt something settle in her chest. This was what she'd come for. This vast, indifferent, beautiful wilderness that would judge her only on her ability to survive. "That's it," Brannon said, pointing to a distant cluster of buildings. "What's left of your inheritance?" "Even from here." Sarah could see the sagging roof, the gaps in the fence, the barn door hanging askew. It looked abandoned, forgotten, reclaimed by the wild. It looked like the hardest challenge she'd ever faced. It looked like home.
Well then, she said, nudging Biscuit forward. Let's see what needs doing. Brannon fell in beside her, and together they descended toward the valley and whatever waited there. Sarah didn't know if she'd made a terrible mistake or found her salvation, but she was here now, and there was no turning back. The mountains watched, impassive and eternal, as one more soul came to test herself against their ancient strength. The barn door hung at a drunken angle, creaking in the wind like a wounded animal. Sarah stood in the doorway of what had been her uncle's cabin, trying not to let despair overwhelm her. The main room was a disaster, furniture overturned, pack rats' nests in the corners, and a hole in the roof that had let in snow and rain. The bedroom where Uncle Josiah had died was worse, and she quickly closed that door, unable to face it yet. "Told you it was bad," Brannon said from behind her. He'd been checking the barn and outbuildings. "Good news is the walls are sound. Foundation, too. It's fixable. Just needs work." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. The ride to his ranch and back with tools and 2 of his men had taken most of the afternoon. Now, with darkness approaching, the reality of her situation hit hard. This wasn't a home, it was barely shelter. "We'll get the main room cleared and patch that roof enough to keep the snow out," Brannon continued, already organizing. "Jake, start pulling out anything that's ruined. Miguel, get a fire going in that stove if the chimney's clear." The 2 ranch hands set to work without complaint. Jake was young, maybe 20, with sandy hair and an easy smile. Miguel was older, weathered by sun and wind, moving with the economy of someone who'd learned not to waste effort. Sarah shook off her paralysis and joined the work. She hauled ruined furniture outside, swept years of debris from corners, and scrubbed what could be salvaged. Her fine traveling dress was soon filthy, but she didn't care. This was what she'd come for, the chance to build something with her own hands. As she worked, she became aware of Brannon watching her. Not obviously, but she'd catch his glance when hauling heavy items or climbing to reach high shelves. She expected to see the familiar judgment a woman doing men's work, but found only assessment. Night fell quickly in the mountains. Miguel had managed to get the stove working after clearing an alarming amount of birds' nests from the chimney. The warmth was a blessing, though it emphasized how cold the rest of the cabin was. "That's enough for tonight," Brannon declared as Jake hammered the last board over the hole in the roof. "We'll come back tomorrow with more supplies." "I'm staying," Sarah said. All 3 men looked at her. "Miss Elwood," Jake started, "you can't stay here. It ain't safe or proper. This is my home now." Sarah straightened her aching back. "I appreciate all you've done, but I won't be driven off by a little dirt and cold." "A little dirt?" Brannon's voice held something that might have been amusement. "You've got gaps in the chinking big enough for snakes to crawl through. That patched roof won't hold if it snows again, and we haven't even checked if the well's frozen. Then I'll keep the fire going and melt snow for water." Sarah met his gray eyes steadily. "Mr. Brannon, I've come 2,000 miles to be here. I'm not spending another night in town when my own land is under my feet." They stared at each other for a long moment. Sarah was used to backing down when men got that look, the one that said a woman should know her place. But something in this wild country had already begun changing her, or maybe revealed who she'd always been underneath the Kansas propriety. "Miguel," Brannon said without looking away from her, "bring in that extra bedroll from my pack, and the coffee pot. If Miss Elwood's determined to freeze, least we can do is leave her supplies." The 2 hands exchanged glances, but obeyed. Soon, Sarah had a bedroll near the stove, a kettle for melting snow, and enough food for several days. Brannon added a shotgun and shells from his own supplies. "That's better than a rifle for close work," he said. "Anything comes through that door that isn't human, you point and shoot. Don't hesitate." What might come through? Bear, wolf, mountain cat. Though this time of year, they're mostly sleeping. More likely just pack rats, or maybe a confused deer. He paused at the door. "We'll be back at first light. Try not to burn the place down or shoot yourself in the foot." After they left,
Sarah stood in the middle of her salvaged main room. The silence was absolute, pressing against her ears like cotton. No distant train whistles, no neighbors' voices, no church bells, just the pop of wood in the stove and her own breathing. She busied herself with settling in, using melted snow. She scrubbed the table and one chair clean enough to use. She found her uncle's coffee pot, dented but functional, and set water to boil. In a trunk that had escaped the worst damage, she discovered blankets that only needed airing and some preserved food, hardtack and jerky that had survived in sealed tins. As she worked, she felt Uncle Josiah's presence. His pipe still sat on the mantel. His books lined a rough shelf. A pair of worn boots stood by the door as if waiting for him to step into them. She touched each item gently, trying to understand the man who'd chosen this isolation, who'd written her letters full of joy about mountain sunrises and eagle cries. A sound outside made her freeze footsteps on the porch, too heavy for any of the small creatures Brannon had mentioned. Sarah grabbed the shotgun, heart pounding. The door latch rattled. "Who's there?" she called, proud when her voice didn't shake. The rattling stopped. Then came a low woof of breath and the sound of something large moving away. Sarah crept to the window, peering through a gap in the boards. In the moonlight, she saw a massive shape lumbering toward the barn the bear the sheriff had mentioned, probably wondering why his winter den suddenly had a fire in it. She watched until it disappeared into the darkness, then checked every door and window. Most were secure enough, and she wedged chairs against the ones that weren't. It wasn't much protection, but it made her feel better. The night stretched long and strange. Every sound outside had her reaching for the shotgun. The wind through the gaps in the walls sounded like voices. Once, she could have sworn she heard her name called, but when she listened harder, it was just the creek gurgling under its coat of ice. She dozed fitfully in the chair, unwilling to lie down and be vulnerable. Her dreams were full of Kansas sunshine and Thomas's scornful face. She woke with tears on her cheeks and her mother's name on her lips. The fire had died to embers. Shivering, she added wood and huddled close to the warmth. Outside, something howled wolf or wind. She couldn't tell. The sound raised primitive fears, made her question everything that had brought her here. What was she doing? A woman alone in a broken cabin, surrounded by wilderness and danger. Her father had been right, this was foolishness. She should have stayed in Kansas, found another man who'd overlook her height, settled for a safe life of small dreams. But as she had the thought, anger flared. Settled for less because she was too tall, too strong, too much herself, no. She'd rather freeze in this cabin than warm herself at the fire of someone else's life. She stood and paced, partly for warmth and partly to burn off the fear. This was just the first night. It would get easier. It had to. Dawn came slowly, gray light seeping through the cracks. Sarah had never been so glad to see morning. She ventured out for more snow to melt, gasping at the cold but thrilling at the view. Mountains rose on all sides, painted pink and gold by the rising sun. The valley stretched white and pristine, marked only by animal tracks and the path the men had broken yesterday. She was standing transfixed when the sound of horses made her turn. Brannon was back, as promised, with Miguel and Jake and another pack horse loaded with supplies. "You survived," Brannon observed, swinging down from his mount. "Did you expect otherwise?" "Honestly, thought we'd find you packed and ready to go back to town." He studied her face, noting something there that made him nod slowly. "But you've got the look now." "What look?" "The one that says the mountain tested you and you didn't break." He turned to unload supplies. "Jake, get started on that roof properly. Miguel, help me with the chinking. Miss Elwood, you might want to see what can be done with that excuse for a kitchen." They worked through the day, transforming the cabin from disaster to merely rough. The roof was patched properly, gaps in the walls filled, the chimney cleaned and drawing well. Sarah scrubbed and organized while the men handled the heavy repairs. By evening, The place was recognizable as a home. "Thank you," Sarah said as they prepared to leave again. "What do I owe you for the supplies and labor?" Brannon named a figure that seemed too low, but she didn't argue. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford yet. "There's something else," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "My ranch is 10 miles west. Like I said, but there's a line shack about 3 miles from here, up on the ridge. I keep it stocked for the men working this range. If you get in trouble, real trouble, there's a bell there. Ring it 3 times and wait. Someone will hear." Sarah filed this information away. "I hope not to need it." "Hope's not a plan out here." He mounted his horse, then looked back. "You did good today. Josiah would be proud." After they left, Sarah stood in her doorway watching the sun set behind the mountains. Her cabin, her home, was still rough, still cold, still a far cry from the comfortable house in Kansas. But it was hers, earned with sweat and stubbornness. That night, she slept in the bedroom after airing it thoroughly and trying not to think about Uncle Josiah's last hours. The wind still whistled through small gaps, and sometimes she heard the bear snuffling around outside, but the fear was less, replaced by something that might have been the beginning of belonging. She'd survived her first night in the wilderness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, she pulled the blankets high and listened to the mountain's lullaby of wind and wolf and whispering pines. It sounded almost like welcome. The morning sun had barely crested the eastern peaks when Sarah heard the horses. She'd been up since before dawn, melting snow for coffee and planning her day's work. 3 days had passed since Brannon and his men had helped repair the cabin, and she'd settled into a routine of sorts: morning chores, wood gathering, afternoon repairs, evening preparations for the cold night ahead. She stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the glare off the snow. Brannon rode at the front, but this time he wasn't alone. 2 other riders flanked him, their horses moving with the careful gait of mounts carrying men who expected trouble. "Morning, Miss Elwood," Brannon called, dismounting with his usual fluid grace. "Mind if we water the horses?" "Of course not." Sarah noticed how his companions remained mounted, hands resting casually near their weapons. "Is something wrong?" "Maybe." Brannon led his horse to the trough she'd cleared of ice that morning. "Found some tracks yesterday, cutting across your north pasture. Looked like 3, maybe 4 riders, moving slow and careful-like. One of the other men, older with a gray-streaked beard, spat tobacco juice into the snow. Weren't no neighbors paying social calls, that's certain. Tracks led up toward the tree line, then doubled back east." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Rustlers. Could be worse." Brannon's expression was grim. "There's been talk in town about strangers asking questions, men looking for abandoned properties, places where the owners died or moved on. Claim jumpers," the second rider said. He was younger, with the hard look of someone who'd seen too much too young. "Happened over in Silver Creek last month. Widow Watson went to town for supplies, came back to find 3 men had moved into her place, took the sheriff and half the town to root them out." Sarah's hand went unconsciously to the shotgun just inside her door. "But I have legal deed to this land. Paper don't mean much to men like that." The older rider said, "Possession's what counts out here. You hold it or you lose it." Brannon finished watering his horse and turned to face her. "Tom and Will here are going to scout the ridges, see if those tracks lead anywhere useful. I wanted to stop and warn you. Might be nothing, but I should be prepared." Sarah squared her shoulders. "I appreciate the warning. There's more." Brannon seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "Your uncle's place being empty for so long. Word's gotten around. Some folks might figure a woman alone can't hold it." Heat flared in Sarah's chest. "Then they'll learn otherwise." Tom, the younger rider, snorted. "No offense, ma'am, but one woman with a shotgun ain't much against determined men. My uncle managed alone." "Your uncle was Josiah Elwood." Will said with surprising gentleness. Man had a reputation. Fought in the Mexican War, trapped with Jim Bridger, faced down a grizzly with nothing but a knife. Men thought twice about crossing him.
And I'm just his weak city niece.
The bitterness in her voice surprised even her.
Didn't say that.
Brandon's gray eyes studied her intently.
But facts are facts. You need to be ready for trouble, and you need to know when you're outnumbered.
Sarah wanted to argue, to insist she could handle whatever came, but the memory of that first night, jumping at every sound, reminded her that pride could get her killed out here. What do you suggest? Keep that shotgun loaded and close. Bar the doors at night. And if you see riders you don't recognize, you get to that line shack and ring the bell. Don't wait to see if they're friendly. I won't be driven off my land by shadows and maybes. Nobody's saying you should be. Brandon swung back into his saddle.
Just be smart about it.
Dead martyrs don't hold deeds. After they left, Sarah tried to return to her chores, but the peaceful morning was ruined. Every distant sound made her look up. Every movement in the tree line had her reaching for the gun. This wasn't how she'd imagined her new life, jumping at shadows, dependent on neighbors' warnings. She forced herself to continue working, splitting wood with perhaps more force than necessary. Uncle Josiah had lived here alone for years. Surely she could manage. But doubt crept in like the cold through the cabin walls. What if Thomas had been right? What if she was unsuited for any life? Kansas or Colorado? The crack of a breaking branch spun her around. Axe raised, a deer bounded away, white tail flashing. Sarah lowered the axe with shaking hands, angry at her fear. By midday, she'd had enough. She saddled Biscuit and rode the boundaries of her property, needing to see what was hers, to understand the land she was supposedly defending. The tracks Brandon had mentioned were clear in the snow horses moving single file along the ridge, pausing at overlooks that gave clear views of her cabin. She followed them until they veered onto what must be government land, then turned back. The sun was already westering, and she didn't want to be caught out after dark, but the ride had helped, reminding her why she'd come. The valley spread below her, pristine and beautiful, with her cabin tucked against the southern slope like it had grown there. Mine, she thought fiercely. Let them try to take it. That evening, she took inventory of her defenses. The shotgun, a rifle she'd found in the barn, her uncle's old pistol, ammunition for all three, though not as much as she'd like. The cabin was solid now, thanks to Brandon's help, with good sight lines from the windows. If trouble came, she wouldn't be taken by surprise. She was cleaning the rifle when she heard horses again. The sun had just set, painting the snow purple and rose. Sarah grabbed the shotgun and crept to the window. One rider, leading a pack horse. As he drew closer, she recognized Brandon's broad shoulders and easy seat. Some of the tension left her spine, though she kept the gun ready. Just because he'd helped her didn't mean she trusted completely. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Miss Elwood, he called from a safe distance. It's Luke Brannon. Mind if I come in? She opened the door but didn't lower the shotgun. Kind of late for a social call. Not social. He dismounted, movements slow and clear. Tom found where those tracks led. There's a camp about 5 miles northeast, just over the boundary. 3 men, maybe 4. They're not trying to hide, which means they're either stupid or confident. Or both. That drew a slight smile. Or both? I brought some supplies, figured you might be running low on a few things. Sarah finally lowered the gun. I can pay. We'll settle up later. He began unloading the pack horse. Flour, salt pork, ammunition, coffee. More than she'd asked for. More than neighboring kindness required. Why are you doing this? He paused, a sack of flour in his hands. I told you, I owed your uncle. This seems like more than paying back a debt. Brannon set the flour on her porch and turned to face her. In the fading light, his features were hard to read. Maybe I don't like the idea of claim jumpers in these mountains. Maybe I think Josiah's niece deserves a fair chance. Or maybe... He stopped, shook his head. Doesn't matter. Point is, you've got neighbors who won't stand by while thieves try to take what's yours. Something passed between them in the gathering darkness. A recognition Sarah wasn't ready to examine. She stepped back. I should get these supplies inside before they freeze. I'll help. They worked in companionable silence, storing the goods in her small pantry. Sarah was acutely aware of how the cabin felt with another person in it, less empty, less echoing with loneliness. Dangerous thoughts. I should go, Brannon said when they finished. But I wanted to tell you Tom and some of the boys will be working this range for the next few days. You'll see them passing by. Don't shoot them by mistake. I'll try to restrain myself. He smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his weathered face. You know, you're not what I expected when I heard Josiah's city niece was coming. So you've said. What did you expect? Someone softer. Someone who'd take one look at these mountains and that broken-down cabin and head straight back to civilization. He moved toward the door, then paused. I'm glad I was wrong. After he left, Sarah stood in her doorway despite the cold, watching until the darkness swallowed him. The cabin felt emptier than before, filled with the echo of presence rather than its reality. She shook off the melancholy and set about her evening routine. Bar the doors, bank the fire, check the guns, but her mind kept returning to Brannon's visit, the careful way he'd moved, the supplies he'd brought without being asked. In Kansas, courtship had been formal parlor visits, chaperoned walks, careful conversations about suitable topics. Thomas had courted her for 6 months before proposing, and she'd thought she knew him, but she'd learned more about Luke Brannon in a week than she'd known about Thomas in all those proper visits. The thought startled her. She wasn't here for romance, she'd had her fill of that. She was here to build a life on her own terms, to prove she didn't need anyone's approval or protection. Yet she couldn't deny the comfort of knowing someone was watching out for her, that riders would be passing by for the next few days. That night, she slept better despite the potential threat lurking in the mountains. She dreamed not of Kansas or Thomas or even the shadowy men camped 5 miles away. She dreamed of spring coming to her valley, of a garden planted and thriving, of sitting on her porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the peaks gold. And if, in her dream, a tall figure on horseback appeared on the ridge, heading down to join her well, dreams weren't plans. They were just the heart's way of whispering possibilities into the darkness. She woke to fresh snow falling and the sound of horses passing by Tom or one of the other ranch hands, making good on Brannon's promise. Sarah built up the fire and started her day, shotgun close but fear distant. She had work to do, a life to build, a claim to hold. Let them come. These men who thought a woman alone was easy prey. They'd learn what Josiah Elwood's niece was made of, and maybe, in the learning, she'd discover it too. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Sarah woke with the sun, tended her animals. She'd acquired 2 chickens and a milk goat from a family passing through and worked on improving her homestead. The mysterious riders hadn't materialized into trouble, though she still saw their tracks occasionally, always skirting her boundaries like wolves testing for weakness. Luke Brannon came by every few days, always with some reasonable excuse, checking fence lines, warning about weather, bringing news from town. Sarah knew these visits were more than neighborly duty, but she didn't examine them too closely. She'd learned to accept help without sacrificing pride, a delicate balance in this unforgiving country. This morning, she was mending harnesses in the barn when she heard his horse approaching. Something in her chest lifted a feeling she quickly suppressed. She didn't look up when his shadow fell across the doorway. You're getting good at that, he observed, watching her work the leather. Had a good teacher. She kept her eyes on the stitching. Uncle Josiah left detailed notes about everything. Found them in a box under his bed. That sounds like him. Always preparing for... Luke didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. always preparing for the day he wouldn't be here. She tied off the thread and finally looked up. Luke stood relaxed against the doorframe, but she'd learned to read the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand never strayed far from his weapon. "What brings you by today? More fence lines to check." "Actually, I came to ask a favor." He shifted, suddenly seeming younger, less sure. "We're branding next week. Could use an extra hand if you're willing. Pays fair. And Maria, that's our cook, could use help feeding the crew." Sarah set down the harness. "You need me to cook?" "Need you to work. However you're most useful. Can you rope?" The question sparked memory, her uncle teaching her in the field behind their Kansas home, her father scolding that it wasn't ladylike, her mother's quiet smile as Sarah mastered the throws anyway. "I can rope." Luke's eyes glinted with something like approval. "Then you'll work the branding. Maria can manage the cooking. She'd be insulted if anyone implied otherwise." "When?" "Monday. I'll send Jake to escort you to the ranch." He paused. "Unless you'd rather not." "I'll be ready." Sarah stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "I won't take charity, Mr. Brannon. If I work like anyone else." "Wouldn't expect otherwise." He turned to go, then looked back. "And Sarah, it's just Luke. We're past formalities. Don't you think?" After he left, Sarah stood in the barn, heart beating faster than warranted. He'd used her given name, such a small thing, yet it felt like crossing a bridge she couldn't uncross. The weekend passed in preparation. She mended her split skirt, scandalous by Kansas standards, but necessary for real work. She practiced with her rope until her hands remembered every motion. She tried not to think about spending days at Luke's ranch, working alongside his men, being part of something larger than her solitary existence. Monday dawned clear and cold. Jake arrived as promised, cheerful as always. "Morning, Miss Sarah. Ready to show these cowboys how it's done." The ride to the Rocking Bee Ranch took 2 hours through country that grew more spectacular with each mile. When they crested the final ridge, Sarah caught her breath. The ranch spread below like something from a painting, solid buildings arranged around a main house, corrals full of cattle, smoke rising from multiple chimneys. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. "Mr. Brannon's built it up considerable since he arrived 5 years back. Started with nothing but a lean-to and stubborn pride. Now he's got one of the finest spreads in the territory." The yard buzzed with activity. Cowboys checked equipment, horses milled in the corral, and the air rang with shouts and laughter. Sarah felt suddenly out of place. Too tall, too female, too obviously not belonging. Then Luke emerged from the main house, and some of her nervousness eased. He wore work clothes like the other men, but authority sat on him like a well-fitted coat. "Sarah, good. You're here." He gestured to a tough-looking woman emerging from what must be the cookhouse. "Maria, this is Sarah Elwood. Sarah, Maria runs the kitchen and most everything else around here." Maria looked her up and down with sharp black eyes. "You're Josiah's niece. He spoke of you." Her English carried the music of Spanish beneath it. "Can you work, or are you here to decorate?" "I can work." "Bueno, we'll see." Maria turned to Luke. "Where you want her?" "With the ropers for now. Tom can show her the setup." Sarah spent the morning learning the rhythm of branding. It was brutal. Efficient work riders roping calves, wrestlers pinning them, the Iron Man applying the brand. The smell of burning hair and hide filled the air. Sarah's job was to rope the calves and drag them to the wrestlers, requiring skill and timing. Her first throw missed, earning good-natured ribbing from the men. The second caught but slipped. By the third, muscle memory kicked in. The rope flew true, settled around the calf's neck, and she backed Biscuit smoothly, dragging the bawling animal to where Tom waited. Not bad for a city girl, someone called. Not bad for anyone, Tom corrected, and Sarah felt a flush of pride. The work was exhausting. By noon, her arms ached and her throat was raw from dust. When Maria rang the dinner bell, Sarah could barely dismount, but she'd kept pace, earned a few nods of respect, felt part of something for the first time in months. Lunch was a noisy affair in the yard, men wolfing down beans and beef while trading stories. Sarah found herself sitting with Jake and Miguel, listening to tales of storms weathered and cattle saved. Luke moved among his men, checking on injuries branding was dangerous work and discussing the afternoon's plan. "You're doing well," he said, stopping by her spot. "Tom says you've got good hands." "They're sore hands right now," Sarah admitted, flexing her rope-burned palms. Luke studied them with a frown.
"Should have given you gloves. Maria has salve that'll help. See her before we start again."
The concern in his voice warmed her more than it should. Sarah looked away, catching Maria watching them with knowing eyes. The afternoon passed in a blur of dust and cattle. Sarah found her rhythm, working in sync with the team, once, when a calf broke free and charged toward the remuda. She wheeled Biscuit and dropped a loop over its head before the cowboys on foot could scatter. The approving shout that went up made her grin despite her exhaustion. As the sun lowered, Luke called a halt. "Good work, everyone. Same time tomorrow." Sarah helped unsaddle horses and store equipment, not wanting to be treated differently. But when the work was done and the men headed to the bunkhouse, she stood uncertainly in the yard.
"Stay for supper,"
Luke said, appearing at her elbow.
"Maria always makes extra, and you've earned it."
She should refuse. Propriety demanded she return to her cabin before dark, but propriety had died somewhere on the trail from Kansas.
"I'd like that."
Supper was quieter than lunch. Just Luke, Maria, and Sarah around the kitchen table. The main house was simple but well built, with thick walls and windows facing the mountains. It felt like a home, not just shelter.
"You did good today,"
Maria said, ladling more stew onto Sarah's plate.
"These cowboys, they respect work, not talk. You showed them work."
"I had help," Sarah said, thinking of Tom's patient instruction, Jake's encouragement. "That's the point," Luke said. "Out here, we help each other, not charity survival." They talked of small things, the weather, the cattle count, news from town. Sarah learned that Maria had been with Luke since the beginning, cooking for cowboys and mothering the younger hands. That Luke had started with 100 head and built to 500 through sheer determination. That the Rocking Bee had a reputation for fair dealing and good horses. "Why the Rocking Bee?" Sarah asked. Luke smiled. "My mother's maiden name was Brennan. Seemed right to honor her memory." The smile faded. "She died when I was 15. Fever took her and my sister both. I'm sorry. Long time ago." He stared into his coffee cup. "That's when I left home. Nothing left to stay for. Drifted for years before finding this place." Sarah understood the weight of loss, the way it shaped you. "My mother died 3 years ago. That's when Uncle Josiah started writing more, asking me to come west. I think he knew I'd need somewhere to go eventually. But you stayed in Kansas."
"I thought I had reasons to—"
The words came out bitter.
"Turns out I was wrong."
Luke's gray eyes studied her.
"Their loss."
The simple statement hit harder than flowery sympathy would have. Sarah looked away, blinking rapidly.
"I should go.
It'll be dark soon." "I'll ride with you."
"That's not necessary." "Sarah."
The way he said her name stopped her protest.
"Let me—"
They rode in comfortable silence through the gathering dusk. The mountains glowed purple and gold, the air crisp with coming night. Sarah felt the day's work in every muscle, but it was a good ache, earned and honest. At her cabin, Luke helped her unsaddle Biscuit and check the animals. Everything was secure. No sign of trouble. Still, he lingered on the porch.
"Thank you for today,"
Sarah said, "for giving me a chance to prove myself." "You don't need to prove anything to me." He stood close enough that she could see the silver threads in his dark hair, the lines carved by sun and weather. "But I understand needing to prove it to yourself." Something shimmered between them in the fading light. Sarah knew she should step back, go inside, maintain the careful distance that kept things simple. Instead, she stayed where she was, caught in his steady gaze. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked softly. "I'll be there." He touched his hat brim and left, and Sarah stood on her porch until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Her cabin felt too quiet after the day's bustle, too empty after the warmth of Maria's kitchen. But as she prepared for bed, muscles aching and hands raw, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Kansas, not just exhaustion or satisfaction, but belonging. For the first time, Colorado felt less like exile and more like home. She fell asleep thinking of tomorrow, more dust, more cattle, more chances to earn her place. And if her dreams included gray eyes and a quiet voice saying her name, well, she was too tired to guard against them. The mountains kept their silence. Stars wheeled overhead. And somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled, not threatening now, but simply declaring its presence in this vast, wild world where Sarah Elwood was learning to declare hers. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains, fighting winter for every inch of ground. Sarah watched the snow retreat day by day, revealing the brown earth beneath, the promise of green to come. 3 months had passed since she'd arrived in Colorado, and her hands now bore the calluses of hard work, her face the tan of someone who lived under open sky. The branding had lasted a week, and she'd worked every day alongside Luke's men. Since then, she'd helped with other ranch work when needed, trading her labor for supplies and knowledge. The suspicious riders had vanished with the worst of winter, and Sarah had begun to believe she might actually succeed here. This morning brought different news. Luke stood in her doorway, hat in hand, a formality she hadn't seen from him in weeks. "I need to go to Denver," he said without preamble. "Cattle buyers are meeting there, and I have to negotiate contracts for fall delivery." Sarah set down the harness she'd been mending. She seemed to always be mending something these days. "How long will you be gone?" 3 weeks, maybe 4. Depends on the market and the weather." He shifted, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I wanted to ask, that is," Maria suggested. He stopped, took a breath. "Would you consider staying at the ranch while I'm gone? Help Maria with the men. Keep an eye on things." The request surprised her. "Don't you have a foreman for that?" "Tom's good with cattle and horses, not so much with books and figures. And Maria could use the help. Spring's a busy time, new calves dropping daily, and she's not as young as she pretends." He met her eyes directly. "I'd pay you, of course, same as I'd pay anyone." Sarah recognized the careful way he framed it, not charity, not protection, just work that needed doing. Still, the thought of 3 weeks at the ranch, away from her own place. "What about my animals? My cabin?" "Jake can check on them daily. Your goat and chickens would be fine in our barn if you'd rather bring them." She considered. The truth was, her cabin still felt more like shelter than home. The long evenings alone had begun to wear on her, the silence sometimes oppressive despite her determination to embrace solitude. "When do you leave?" "Day after tomorrow. Dawn." "Then I'll come tomorrow. Get settled before you go." Relief flickered across his features before he controlled it. "Good. That's good. Maria will appreciate it." That evening, Sarah packed carefully. Work clothes, her few good garments, the books she'd been reading by lamplight. She walked her property one more time, checking fences, securing what needed securing. This land was hers, had become part of her, but she could admit now that it wasn't enough by itself. She needed more than just survival. The next morning, Jake arrived with a wagon for her belongings and animals. The ride to the ranch felt different this time, not a visitor coming to work, but someone trusted with responsibility. Maria greeted her with unusual warmth. "Good, you're here. That man, he worries too much, but he's right this time. I need help with these cowboys. They get restless in spring like stallions." Luke spent the day showing Sarah the account books, The inventory lists, the dozen small details that kept a ranch running. His hands brushed hers as they bent over the ledgers, and she fought to keep her concentration on numbers instead of the warmth of his presence. "You'll do fine," he said as evening approached. "You've got a good head for this."
"It's not so different from helping Father with the store accounts,"
Sarah said, though that wasn't entirely true.
Her father's neat columns of fabric sales and grain purchases hadn't prepared her for the complexity of cattle contracts and seasonal wages.
After supper, Luke walked her to the small room off the kitchen that would be hers. It was simple but clean, with a window facing the mountains and a quilt that looked like Maria's handiwork.
"Sarah,"
he said, pausing in the doorway.
"I'm grateful for this, for—"
He seemed to search for words.
"Just grateful."
"It's just 3 weeks," she said lightly, though something in his expression made her pulse quicken. "Try not to let those Denver merchants cheat you too badly." He smiled then, the one that transformed his weathered features. "I'll do my best. And Sarah, if there's any trouble, any at all, send word to Sheriff Morrison in town. He's a good man."
"There won't be trouble."
"Probably not, but promise me."
"I promise."
He stood there another moment, as if wanting to say more. Then he touched his hat brim and was gone, leaving Sarah alone in the little room that smelled of lavender and lye soap. She couldn't sleep that night, aware of the different sounds: cowboys in the bunkhouse, horses in the nearby corral, the creak of a house that held other people. When dawn came, she was already dressed, standing on the porch to watch Luke prepare for departure. He'd packed light, just saddlebags and a bedroll. Tom would drive the supply wagon, returning within the week while Luke continued to Denver. A small group gathered to see them off, Maria fussing over provisions, Jake double-checking the horses, Miguel offering advice about the trail. Luke swung into the saddle with his usual grace, then looked down at Sarah. "Take care of things," he said simply.
"I will."
He held her gaze a moment longer, and she thought he might say something else. Instead, he wheeled his horse and set off, Tom following with the wagon. Sarah watched until they disappeared over the ridge, feeling oddly bereft. "Come," Maria said, touching her arm. "Much work to do, and mooning won't make it lighter." The days fell into rhythm quickly. Sarah rose before dawn to help Maria with breakfast for the dozen hands who called the Rocking Bee home. She worked on the books while Maria handled the cooking, finding errors Tom had missed, streamlining systems that had grown haphazard. Afternoons, she helped where needed, treating a colicky horse, holding calves for doctoring, mending gear. The men had accepted her now, no longer watching sideways to see if she'd faint or complain. She'd earned her place through sweat and competence. Evenings were for the ledgers again, and for sitting with Maria on the porch, learning the older woman's stories. Maria had come from Sonora as a young widow, following her brother to the goldfields when he died in a cave-in. She'd survived by cooking for miners, then cowboys, finally finding a permanent place with Luke.
"He's a good man,"
Maria said one evening, apropos of nothing.
"Lonely, though he doesn't say. This house needs more than an old woman and dusty cowboys."
Sarah kept her eyes on her mending.
"He seems content with his life."
"Content and happy aren't the same." Maria's dark eyes were knowing.
"You understand that, I think."
Before Sarah could respond, one of the younger hands came running. "Miss Sarah Ryder's coming in, 3 of them. Don't look familiar." Sarah set aside the mending and reached for the rifle by the door.
"How far out?"
"Just cresting Miller's Ridge. Be here in 20 minutes. Get the men in from the far pasture. Tell them to come armed, but not obvious about it." Sarah turned to Maria.
"Better get inside."
"Bah, I've faced worse than dusty riders." But Maria moved inside, and Sarah noticed she positioned herself by the window where the shotgun rested. The riders came slowly, openly, which eased some of Sarah's concern. Still, she stood on the porch with the rifle cradled in her arms, a clear statement that strangers would be met with caution. They were rough-looking men, trail-worn and hard-eyed. The leader, a man with a scar across his left cheek, touched his hat politely enough. "Afternoon, ma'am. We're looking for Luke Brannon." "He's not here. I'm managing the ranch in his absence. What's your business?" The scarred man exchanged glances with his companions. "We heard he might be hiring for the summer drive." "That won't be decided until Mr. Brannon returns. You're welcome to check back in a few weeks." "Few weeks is a long time to wait without wages." The second man spoke now, younger, with pale eyes that didn't match his smile. "Maybe you could use some help around here while he's gone. Looks like you're short-handed." "We have all the help we need." Sarah kept her voice steady, though her heart raced. These weren't ordinary drifters looking for work. "That's so," the third man, silent until now, spit tobacco juice near the porch. "Seems like a lot of ranch for a woman to handle." Sarah heard horses behind the house, the hands Tom had sent for, arriving quietly. The knowledge gave her courage. "As I said, we're fully staffed. There's a boarding house in town if you need lodging." The scarred leader studied her for a long moment. His eyes took in the rifle, her steady stance, the strategic positions of the ranch buildings. Whatever he saw seemed to change his calculations. "We'll be moving on then. Sorry to trouble you, ma'am." He touched his hat again, the gesture mocking this time. "You tell Brannon that Bill Hennessy came calling. He'll remember me." They rode out slowly, and Sarah didn't lower the rifle until they disappeared from sight. Only then did she realize she was trembling. Jake and the others emerged from their positions. "Want us to follow them? Make sure they leave the area?" Jake asked. "No, but double the night watch, and keep the rifles handy." Sarah looked at each man. "Anyone know this Bill Hennessy?" Miguel nodded grimly. "See, he rode with Brannon years ago, before Brannon went straight. There was trouble between them. Bad blood over money, maybe a woman, if he's here now." He didn't need to finish. Sarah understood. The past had a way of following men west, and not all of it was welcome. That night, she wrote a letter to Luke in Denver, detailing the visit, Hennessy's name, the implicit threat. She sent Jake to town at first light with instructions to send it by fastest post. Then she returned to the routine of ranch work, though now with heightened vigilance. A week passed without incident. Sarah began to hope Hennessy had truly moved on. She was checking the milk cows one evening, enjoying the peaceful task, when she heard Maria scream. She ran for the house, rifle in hand, to find Maria on the kitchen floor, blood seeping from a gash on her forehead. The back door stood open, and flour from the overturned bin coated everything like snow. "2 men," Maria gasped as Sarah knelt beside her. "Looking for money. I told them we keep nothing here, but they didn't believe." Sarah heard boots on the porch and turned, raising the rifle, but it was Jake and Tom, drawn by the scream. "Get after them," she ordered. 2 men, probably on foot, and Tom, send someone for the doctor. Quickly. As the men scattered to search, Sarah tended Maria's wound. It was ugly, but not deep, though head wounds always bled fearfully. Maria tried to sit up. "The strong box." "Never mind that." Sarah pressed a clean cloth to the wound. "Just be still." But Maria was right to worry. The strong box Luke kept in his study was gone, along with the ranch's operating funds and the men's wages. Sarah felt sick. Luke had trusted her with his ranch, and she'd failed to protect it. The search turned up nothing. The thieves had vanished into the gathering darkness, probably with horses hidden nearby. Sarah suspected Hennessy's involvement but couldn't prove it. She sat up all night with Maria, keeping watch for concussion signs while guilt gnawed at her. By dawn, Maria was sleeping naturally, and Sarah had made a decision. When Jake appeared for morning orders, she was ready. "Take 4 men and ride to Denver. Find Luke and tell him what's happened. Ride hard, maybe you can catch him before he starts back." "You sure, Miss Sarah? He left us here to protect—" "He left us here to handle problems?"
This is beyond handling.
He needs to know. She paused.
Tell him I'm sorry.
Jake looked like he wanted to argue, then just nodded. We'll find him. The next days were the longest Sarah had endured. Maria recovered slowly, more shaken than she'd admit. The remaining hands were jumpy, weapons always close, and Sarah tortured herself with what-ifs and should-haves. She was feeding chickens, finding comfort in the simple task. When she heard horses approaching fast, her heart leaped, then sank. Too soon for Jake to have reached Denver and returned. But it was Luke who rode into the yard, dust-covered and exhausted, his gray eyes scanning until they found her. He swung down from his lathered horse and crossed to her in long strides.
Are you hurt?
His hands gripped her shoulders, eyes searching her face. No, I'm fine. But Maria? I know. Jake met me 2 days out. I've been riding straight through. His hands gentled but didn't release her. This wasn't your fault. I was responsible. You were here. You protected Maria, kept the ranch running. Hennessy's quarrel is with me, not you. Something fierce flashed in his eyes. When I find him.
Luke.
She covered one of his hands with hers.
I'm glad you're back.
He pulled her against him then. A brief, hard embrace that said more than words. Sarah let herself lean into his strength for just a moment before propriety reasserted itself and she stepped back.
Maria's inside. She'll want to see you.
But Luke didn't move immediately. Sarah, what you did, staying here, facing them down, I won't forget it. She managed a small smile.
I told you I could handle things.
You did better than I could have asked. He touched her cheek, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. We need to talk. After I see Maria, after I deal with all this, we need to talk about things. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Then Maria's voice called from inside, querulous and demanding, and the moment broke. Luke went to reassure his old friend while Sarah returned to the chickens, her heart beating a rhythm that had nothing to do with thieves or stolen money. He was back, he was safe, and he wanted to talk about things. Sarah scattered feed with shaking hands and tried not to hope too hard about what those things might be. The storm came without warning. Sarah had spent the day at her own cabin, having returned after Luke's homecoming to give him time to sort out the ranch's affairs. She'd needed the solitude to think, to process the emotions that his brief embrace had stirred. Now, as purple-black clouds rolled over the mountains like an avalanche, she hurried to secure everything. The animals were moved to shelter, windows shuttered, firewood brought inside. She'd learned to read the mountain weather, and this had all the signs of a bad one. The first crack of thunder made her horse shy in the barn. Lightning illuminated the valley in stark, momentary brilliance. Then the rain came, not gradually but all at once, as if the sky had torn open. Sarah made it to the cabin just as hail began mixing with the rain. She slammed the door and leaned against it, catching her breath. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in minutes. Spring in the mountains, she'd learned, could turn vicious without warning. She built up the fire and settled in to wait it out, but as the hours passed, the storm only intensified. Wind howled through the gaps in the walls she thought she'd sealed. The roof Luke and his men had repaired groaned ominously. Near midnight, she heard something different above the storm's fury, the bell from the line shack, ringing frantically. 3 times, pause, 3 times again, the emergency signal. Sarah's blood chilled. Someone was in trouble up there. She thought of Luke, possibly caught on the trail if he'd decided to check the cattle in the high pasture. The bell rang again, desperate. She didn't hesitate, pulling on her uncle's old oilcloth coat. She grabbed a lantern, rope, and the medical supplies she'd assembled over the months. The journey to the line shack usually took 20 minutes. Tonight, it would take longer. The moment she stepped outside, the wind nearly knocked her down. Rain hit like cold needles, and she could barely see beyond the lantern's feeble circle. But she knew the path. had ridden it enough times. She trusted her feet and her instincts. Halfway there, her horse's whinny cut through the storm. Biscuit stood hobbled by a lightning-struck tree, reins tangled in the branches. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the saddle Luke's. "Easy, girl," she soothed, working to free the frightened mare. Blood on the saddle made her hands shake. "Where is he? Where's Luke?" The horse's eyes rolled white with fear, but Sarah got her free and pointed toward home. "Go on, get to the barn." Biscuit needed no encouragement, disappearing into the storm. Sarah pushed on, fighting wind that tried to tear her off the mountainside. The line shack finally appeared, its door banging open. She stumbled inside to find Luke slumped against the wall, his face pale in the lantern light. "Sarah," his voice was thick with pain. "What are you? You shouldn't be here." "I heard the bell." She knelt beside him, assessing quickly. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and blood seeped through a tear in his coat. "What happened?" "Lightning spooked the horse. Went down hard. Leg caught under her." He tried to shift and gasped. "Think it's broken. Maybe ribs, too." Sarah's hands moved with purpose born of necessity. Living alone had taught her rough medicine, how to set a chicken's leg, stitch a deep cut, treat fever with willow bark. But this was different. This was Luke, and the storm gave no sign of breaking. "I need to set the leg," she said. "It's going to hurt." "Can't hurt worse than it does now." He managed a ghost of his usual smile. "Should have listened to Maria. She said storm was coming." Sarah found wood for a splint and tore strips from her petticoat for bandages. The intimacy of it, her hands on his body. His pain-filled breathing in her ear might have embarrassed her once. Now there was only the need to help him. "Ready?" she asked. He nodded, jaw clenched. Sarah gripped his leg, feeling for the break. One swift pull to align the bones. Luke's cry tore through her, but she held steady, splinting quickly while he was still reeling from the pain. "Done," she said. "The worst is done." His hand found hers, gripping hard. "You came through that storm for me." "You'd have done the same." "That's not the point." His gray eyes, usually so guarded, were open with pain and something else. "Sarah, Another crack of thunder shook the shack. Wind tore at the roof, and suddenly part of it peeled away like paper. Rain poured in, soaking them both. "We can't stay here," Sarah said. "Can you ride?" "Not sure I can stand." But he had to. Sarah got her shoulder under his arm, taking as much weight as she could. Together they struggled upright, Luke breathing hard through clenched teeth. "My cabin's closer than the ranch," she said. "Can you make it?" "With you, I'd walk through hell itself." The words might have been pain talking, but they warmed her anyway. They stumbled into the storm, Sarah bearing more of Luke's weight with each step. The rain had turned to sleet, coating everything in ice. Twice Luke went to his knees, and twice Sarah hauled him up through sheer determination. "Leave me," he gasped. "Get to safety." "Don't be stupid." She tightened her grip. "We're almost there." It was a lie they weren't even halfway, but surrender wasn't in her vocabulary. Not anymore. She'd crossed half a continent to find her place in the world. She wouldn't lose the man who'd helped her claim it. Time lost meaning in the storm. There was only the next step, the next breath, the next moment of keeping Luke upright. When her cabin finally loomed through the darkness, Sarah almost sobbed with relief. She got him inside and onto the bed, not caring about propriety or muddy boots on clean quilts. He was shivering violently, shock setting in. Sarah built up the fire until it roared, then faced the necessity of getting him out of his soaked clothes. "I'm sorry," she said, working at buttons with numb fingers. "But you'll die of cold otherwise." "Sarah," his hand covered hers, stilling it. "My coat pocket, left side." She found what he meant, a small leather pouch. Inside was a folded paper and something wrapped in cloth. "Read it," he said. The paper was a deed transfer, dated a week before he left for Denver. He'd legally assigned her a section of his land that bordered hers prime, grazing with good water access.
I don't understand. She said, "Yes, you do."
His eyes found hers.
Man doesn't give away his best pasture to just anyone. Had it drawn up proper. In case.
In case what? In case I was too much a coward to say what needs saying when I got back. He shifted, wincing. Open the other. The cloth held a ring not fancy, just a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone. Was my mother's, Luke said. Carried it to Denver and back, trying to figure how to ask. Then Hennessy came, and you faced him down, and I knew I couldn't wait anymore. Life's too short and too uncertain. Sarah stared at the ring, her heart hammering.
Luke!
I know what I am, he interrupted. Older than you, set in my ways, with a past that isn't pretty. But I also know what you are, strong and brave and so beautiful it takes my breath. I love you. Sarah Elwood. Have since you stood in Morrison's store and told me you didn't need charity. His voice roughened. I'm not asking for an answer now. Just think about it. Sarah set the ring carefully aside and resumed undressing him, her hands steadier now despite the tears on her cheeks.
You're delirious from pain,
she said. We'll talk when you're better. But she was gentle as she got him into dry clothes, her uncle's, kept for sentiment. She checked his ribs, bruised but not broken, and dosed him with willow bark tea for the pain and fever.
Sarah,
he said as she pulled blankets over him. I meant every word.
I know.
She smoothed his hair back, allowing herself that small intimacy.
Rest now.
He caught her hand.
Stay close.
There was only one bed, but Sarah was past caring about scandal. She lay beside him on top of the covers, listening to the storm rage outside. Luke's breathing evened into sleep, but his hand never released hers. Sometime near dawn, the storm finally broke. Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through the windows, and Luke watching her with clearer eyes. You saved my life, he said simply.
You gave me a life worth living,
she replied. Seems fair. He lifted their joined hands, studying them. Sarah, what I said last night.
I know what you said.
She took a breath, her free hand finding the ring on the bedside table.
The answer is yes.
His whole body stilled.
Yes. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I love you. Yes to all of it.
She smiled through fresh tears.
Assuming you survive this and can make it to a church.
He pulled her down for a kiss that was answer enough, gentle at first, then deeper as months of careful distance dissolved. When they broke apart, both breathing hard. Luke's gray eyes held a light she'd never seen before. Soon as this leg heals, he promised, I'll court you proper.
Luke Brannon,
you've been courting me since the day we met. You just didn't know it. Maybe I did. He touched her face with wondering fingers. Maybe I knew from the start you were meant to be here, to be mine. Outside, the sun climbed higher, revealing a world washed clean by the storm. The mountains stood eternal and indifferent, but in the small cabin at their feet, two souls had found what they'd come west, seeking not just land or freedom, but each other. Sarah lay her head on Luke's shoulder, careful of his injuries, and watched the light dance across the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring challenges, healing. Hennessy still at large. A wedding to plan. 2 properties to merge. But for now, there was this the man she loved breathing beside her, the ring warm in her hand, and a future spreading before them as vast and promising as the Colorado sky. The storm had passed, but what it left in its wake was just beginning. The cave was smaller than Sarah had imagined it would be. When Jake and Tom had ridden up at midday with news that Luke's horse had been found wandering near Devil's Canyon, her blood had run cold. Luke had left that morning to check the high pastures despite his legs still being tender from the storm incident 2 weeks prior. His tracks lead toward the old mine shaft, Jake had said, breathless from hard riding.
But there's been a slide. Rocks everywhere. We need help.
Now Sarah crouched at the mouth of what had once been a cave entrance, now mostly blocked by fallen stone. Through a gap barely large enough for her arm, she could hear Luke's voice, strained but alive. "I'm all right," he called. "Just trapped. My legs pinned again, the same damn one." Sarah's hands shook as she examined the rockfall. The other men were already working to clear the larger stones, but progress was slow. Too much force, and the whole thing might collapse inward. "How's your air?" she called through the gap. "Fair for now. But Sarah, you need to be careful. I heard more rocks shifting above." Tom wiped sweat from his brow despite the cool mountain air. "We need more men. I'll ride back to the ranch." "No time," Miguel interrupted, studying the cliff face above. "See those cracks? This whole section could come down. We work now, or—" He didn't finish, but they all understood. Sarah stood, mind racing. "There's another entrance. Has to be. These old mines always had air shafts. Even if there is, could be anywhere on this mountainside." Jake protested. "Take hours to find." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering. Uncle Josiah had written about these caves in his journals. She'd read them during the long winter evenings. Something about markers, about the old-timers always leaving signs. "The trees," she said suddenly. "Look for 3 pines growing close together, bent toward the east. Miners marked their air shafts that way." The men scattered to search while Sarah stayed by the blocked entrance, talking to Luke, keeping his spirits up while hiding her own fear. The sun was already westering. Once darkness fell, any rescue would become nearly impossible. "Found them!" Tom's shout came from higher up the slope. 3 pines, just like she said." Sarah scrambled up the rocky incline, her split skirt catching on brush. The air shaft was there, partially hidden by undergrowth, a dark opening maybe 3 feet across. "I'll need rope," she said, already calculating. "You're not thinking," Jake began. "I'm the smallest. I'll fit." She was already knotting the rope around her waist. "Lower me down. When I find Luke, we'll figure out how to get him up." "It's too dangerous," Tom protested. "If that shaft's unstable, then we'd better hurry." Sarah checked her knots one more time. She'd tucked matches in her pocket, a small knife, and bandages just in case. "Miguel, you're the strongest. You anchor. Jake and Tom, you help with the rope." Before anyone could argue further, she sat at the shaft's edge and swung her legs into darkness. The men had no choice but to lower her, Miguel's strong hand steady on the rope. The descent felt endless. Darkness pressed close, broken only by the thin shaft of light from above. The air grew cooler, thick with the smell of rock and old earth. Sarah's hand scraped against rough stone as she guided herself down. "Luke," she called. "Can you hear me?" "Sarah," his voice came from her left, closer than expected. "What in blazes are you doing?" Her feet touched solid ground. "Rescuing you, apparently, again." She fumbled for matches, struck one. The brief flare showed a narrow tunnel branching off from the shaft. Luke sat against the far wall, his leg trapped under a fall of smaller rocks. His face was pale but alert, a cut on his forehead still seeping blood. "You magnificent, foolish woman," he said as she reached him. "You shouldn't have come down here." "And you shouldn't have gone riding alone with a barely healed leg." She knelt beside him, assessing the situation by matchlight. "Can you feel your foot?" "Yes, it's not crushed, just caught. But I can't get leverage to lift the rocks myself." Sarah studied the pile. If she could shift the larger stone at the top, the others might roll free, but it would take all her strength. And if she was wrong about the angle. "Together," she said, "on 3. They strained against the stone, Luke pushing despite the pain it must have caused. The rock shifted, tilted, and suddenly the smaller stones cascaded away. Luke gasped as his leg came free. "Can you stand?" He tried, leaning heavily on her. "Maybe, but climbing that shaft." Sarah had already realized the problem. even with rope. Luke couldn't climb with an injured leg, and the tunnel to the original entrance was completely blocked from this side. "Miguel," she called up the shaft, "we need a sling. Use the saddle blankets and extra rope. Make it strong enough to hold a man's weight." While they waited, Sarah bandaged Luke's head and checked his leg, bruised and scraped, but not broken again. Thank God. He sat with his back against the tunnel wall, watching her work. "You know," he said conversationally, "most women would have sent for help, not thrown themselves down a mine shaft." "Most women haven't spent a winter learning to be as stubborn as these mountains." She tied off the bandage. "Besides, you still owe me a wedding. Can't have you dying before you make an honest woman of me." "Sarah Elwood, you're already the most honest woman I know." His hand found her face in the dimness. "Also the bravest, most beautiful." "Save the sweet talk for when we're above ground," she said, but she turned her face into his palm for just a moment. The makeshift sling finally appeared, lowered carefully down the shaft. Getting Luke into it required painful contortions in the narrow space, both of them breathless by the time he was secured. "Pull him up slow," Sarah called. "Miguel, watch those walls." The rope grew taut. Luke rose inch by careful inch, Sarah holding her breath until she heard Tom shout that they had him. Then the sling came back down for her. The journey up felt longer than the descent. Halfway, dirt began raining from above. The shaft was starting to give way. Sarah heard Luke shouting something. The other men's voices urgent. She climbed faster, no longer trusting the sling alone, using hands and feet to scramble up the crumbling walls. Strong hands hauled her over the edge just as a section of the shaft collapsed inward. She lay gasping on solid ground while Luke crushed her against him, his arms shaking. "Don't ever," he said against her hair, "ever do anything like that again." "Can't promise that." She pulled back to look at him. Blood had soaked through the bandage on his head, and his face was gray with pain. But he was alive. They both were. Miguel cleared his throat. "The horses, boss. We should go before this whole hillside decides to slide." They made a strange procession down the mountain, Luke on Miguel's steady horse, Sarah walking alongside to steady him, Tom and Jake flanking them with rifles ready. The sun touched the western peaks as they reached safer ground, painting everything gold and rose. "We make a good team," Luke said, swaying slightly in the saddle. "We do." Sarah reached up to steady him, "though I'd prefer our teamwork to involve less life-threatening situations." "Where's the fun in that?" But his attempt at levity failed when his eyes rolled back. Sarah barely caught him as he slumped sideways. "Ride ahead," she ordered Jake. "Get Maria ready. Hot water, bandages, and send someone for the doctor. Quickly." The rest of the ride blurred together, keeping Luke in the saddle, monitoring his breathing, praying the head wound wasn't as bad as the blood suggested. By the time they reached the ranch, Sarah's arms ached from supporting him, and her dress was stained beyond salvage. Maria took charge with her usual efficiency, ordering the men to carry Luke inside while she prepared her medicines. The doctor arrived within the hour he'd been at a neighboring ranch, Providence in their favor. Sarah paced the kitchen while the doctor worked, Maria occasionally bringing updates. Concussion, certainly. The leg badly bruised but not broken. Various cuts and scrapes. Rest and time would heal all. "You can see him now," Maria said finally. "He's asking for you, demanding, actually." Luke lay propped against pillows, head bandaged, looking pale but determined. "We need to set a date," he said without preamble. "What?" "For the wedding. Today proved it, this country's too dangerous to waste time. I want you as my wife, Sarah. Legal and proper and permanent. Next week if the preacher's available." Sarah sat on the bed's edge, taking his hand. "You nearly died today." "Exactly my point. Life's uncertain out here, but whatever time we have, I want to spend it with you." His gray eyes held hers. "Marry me, Sarah." "Not someday soon, before something else tries to kill one of us." She thought of all the proprieties they were ignoring, all the reasons to wait. Then she thought of that endless moment when the shaft began collapsing, when she'd wondered if she'd ever see him again. "Next week," she agreed. Though Maria might have opinions about planning a wedding that fast. "Maria's been planning our wedding since the day you arrived," Luke said dryly. "Trust me, she's ready." As if to prove his point, Maria appeared with a tea tray and a suspiciously innocent expression. "The blue silk from Denver, I think, for your dress. I'll start altering it tomorrow. And Jake can ride to town for the preacher first thing." Sarah looked between them, laughing despite everything. "You two had this planned?" "Not the cave-in," Luke said, "but the rest, maybe." He squeezed her hand. "I meant what I said in your cabin. Sarah, you saved my life in more ways than one. Let me spend the rest of it proving I was worth saving." She leaned down to kiss him gently, mindful of his injuries. "You already have." Outside, night settled over the ranch. In a week, Sarah Elwood would become Sarah Brannon. The girl who'd fled Kansas in shame had found her place, her strength and her heart in these unforgiving mountains. And if that place happened to include mine shafts and storms and the occasional rescue, well, that was the price of loving a man as wild and true as the land itself. Maria bustled about, already making lists. Luke dozed, his hand still holding Sarah's, and Sarah sat watching over him as the stars emerged, one by one, thinking that some prices were worth paying after all. Dawn came slowly to the mountain valley, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold. Sarah stood at the window of Luke's room, their room now, as of tomorrow, watching the light creep across the land that had become her home. Behind her, she could hear Luke stirring, his breathing changing from sleep to wakefulness. "You're up early," he said, voice rough with sleep. "Wedding day nerves," she admitted, turning to face him. His leg had healed well over the past week, though he still favored it slightly. The cuts on his forehead had faded to thin lines that Maria said would barely scar. Second thoughts. There was vulnerability in the question, despite his casual tone. Sarah crossed to the bed, sitting beside him. "Never, just thinking how different this is from what I once imagined." "In Kansas, you mean?" She nodded. "I thought I'd marry Thomas in the church where my parents wed, wear my mother's dress, have my sister as attendant, everything proper and planned and safe." Luke's hand found hers. "I'm sorry you don't have that." "I'm not." She squeezed his fingers. "That life would have crushed me slowly, day by day. This," she gestured toward the window, "the mountains, the life they were building. This is worth more than all the propriety in the world." A knock interrupted them. Maria entered with coffee and her usual bustle. "Up, both of you. There is much to do. The preacher arrives at noon, and half the county is coming to see Luke Brannon finally caught." "Caught," Luke protested. "I did the catching, thank you very much." Maria snorted. "You tell yourself that. Now. Sarah, come. The dress needs final fitting." The morning passed in a whirl of preparations. Jake and the hands had transformed the main room, bringing in wildflowers from the meadows, arranging benches borrowed from town. The kitchen overflowed with food Maria had been cooking for days, determined that no guest would leave hungry. Sarah stood before the mirror in Maria's room, hardly recognizing herself. The blue silk dress had been Maria's treasure, saved from her own youth and altered to fit Sarah's taller frame. It wasn't the fashion of Kansas, but it suited her elegant, yet practical, beautiful without being fussy. "You look like yourself," Maria said, adjusting the last pin. "That's the best thing a bride can look." Through the window, Sarah could see riders arriving. The Hendersons from the neighboring ranch, the sheriff and his wife, Tom Morrison from the general store, even Mrs. Chen from the hotel had made the journey. This community that had seemed so foreign months ago now came to celebrate one of their own. "Sarah," Jake's voice called from downstairs. "Got a surprise for you." She lifted her skirts carefully and descended to find a familiar figure standing in the doorway.
Peter?
Peter Hartwell, the young man from the stagecoach, grinned at her. Heard through the newspaper network that the woman who helped push our stage through a blizzard was getting married. Had to come see for myself. But how did you... Your Luke sent word to Denver. Thought you might want a friend from the journey here, though... He looked around appreciatively. Seems like you've made plenty of new ones. The gesture touched her deeply. Luke had thought of what she might be missing and tried to provide it. She blinked back tears, not wanting to spoil Maria's careful work with her hair. "The preacher's here," someone called, and suddenly everything was motion. Sarah found herself in the bedroom again, Maria fussing with last touches while outside she could hear voices, laughter, the tuning of a fiddle someone had brought. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the small bouquet of mountain columbines Jake had gathered that morning. "Ready?" Maria asked gently. Sarah thought of the journey that had brought her here, the rejection in Kansas, the terrifying storm, that first night alone in the cabin, all the challenges faced and overcome. "I've been ready since the day I left Kansas. I just didn't know it." They walked downstairs together. The main room had filled with people, all turning to watch her entrance. But Sarah saw only Luke, standing by the fireplace in his best clothes, his gray eyes bright with emotion. The slight catch in his breath when he saw her was worth more than all the elaborate weddings in the world. She walked to him alone, no father to give her away, no sister as attendant, but she needed neither. She was giving herself, freely and gladly, to this man who'd seen her strength before her beauty, who'd trusted her with his ranch and his heart. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Mills began, his voice carrying through the hushed room. The ceremony was simple, the vows traditional, but the weight of them felt immense. When Luke slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, properly sized, now Sarah felt the last piece of her new life click into place. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The Reverend said, "You may kiss your bride." Luke's hands framed her face gently.
"Mrs. Brannon,"
he whispered, just for her. "Mr. Brannon," she whispered back, and then his lips met hers, sealing promises that went beyond words. The room erupted in cheers. The fiddle struck up a lively tune, and suddenly the ranch house was alive with celebration. Sarah found herself passed from embrace to embrace ranch hands, offering shy congratulations. Neighboring wives welcoming her officially to their small community. The afternoon flowed like honey, sweet and golden. Tables were set up in the yard to accommodate everyone. Stories were shared. Toasts raised with whatever spirits could be found. Sarah learned that Tom had once saved Luke from a rattlesnake, that Miguel had taught him to read the weather, that this makeshift family of cowboys and neighbors had been hoping for their boss's happiness for years. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Peter approached where Sarah and Luke sat watching the festivities. "I should head back to town before dark," he said. "But I wanted to say you look happy, really happy. That morning on the stage, you seemed so lost. Now you look found." "I am," Sarah said simply. "Both lost and found. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find where you belong." Peter shook Luke's hand, kissed Sarah's cheek, and headed for his horse. Other guests began making similar departures, each offering good wishes and promises to visit. Soon only the ranch hands and Maria remained, cleaning up with practiced efficiency. "Leave it," Luke said, standing and pulling Sarah with him. "Tonight's not for chores." He led her outside, where the last light was fading behind the peaks. They walked slowly, his arm around her waist, her head against his shoulder. Without discussion, their steps turned toward the small hill behind the barn. Uncle Josiah's grave stood there, marked with a simple stone Luke had commissioned. Someone, Maria, probably had placed fresh flowers there today. "Think he knows?" Sarah asked softly. "I think he knew before we did," Luke replied. Why else send for his Kansas niece to inherit this particular piece of land? Josiah was too clever to believe in coincidences. They stood quietly, paying respects to the man who'd brought them together even in death. Then Luke turned Sarah to face him, his expression serious in the twilight. "I need to tell you something. Should have before. But," he took a breath, "Bill Hennessy's been caught. Sheriff Morrison sent word yesterday. They found him trying to rob a stage near Colorado Springs. He won't be troubling us again." Sarah felt a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying lift from her shoulders. "That's why you were so determined to marry quickly. You were worried he'd come back." "Partly, but mostly I just couldn't wait another day to call you my wife." His hands tightened on her waist. "This land is hard. Sarah, it'll test us. Try to break us. There'll be more storms, more dangers I can't predict or prevent." "I know." She reached up to touch his face. "But we'll face them together. That's what marriage means out here. Isn't it? Not just sharing the good times, but standing together against whatever comes." "Together," he agreed, and kissed her again as the first stars appeared overhead. They walked back to the house hand in hand. Maria had left lamps burning in the windows, creating pools of warm light in the gathering darkness. The main room, scene of so much celebration, stood empty now but still holding echoes of joy. "Welcome home, Mrs. Brannon," Luke said as they entered. "I've been home since the day you brought me here," Sarah replied. "I just didn't have the words for it yet." Later, as they lay together watching moonlight silver the mountains through their window, Sarah thought about the letter she'd write to Mary tomorrow. How could she explain this transformation? How could she capture in words the way the mountains had carved her into someone stronger, truer to herself? "No regrets?" Luke asked, his voice drowsy with contentment. "One," Sarah admitted. When he tensed, she smiled. "I wish Uncle Josiah could have been here. He would have liked seeing us prove him right." Luke relaxed, chuckling. "He'd have complained about all the fuss, then eaten more cake than anyone and danced with all the ladies. You knew him well. He was the closest thing to a father I had out here. Taught me about more than cattle and weather. Taught me about waiting for what matters." His arm tightened around her. "You matter, Sarah, more than the ranch, more than anything I've built. You're what makes it all worthwhile." Outside, something howled in the distance, wolf or wind. It didn't matter. The walls were strong, the fire was banked, and Sarah Brannon lay safe in the arms of a man who saw her truly. The girl who'd fled Kansas in shame had become a woman who stood tall in any storm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There was a ranch to run, a merger of lands to manage, a life to build day by day in this unforgiving paradise. But tonight, there was only this two hearts beating together, two souls who'd found home in each other, and a love as enduring as the mountains that sheltered them. The storm had brought them together. Now, under clear skies bright with stars, their real journey could begin. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. If you enjoyed Sarah and Luke's journey, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Leave a comment below. And let's share our thoughts about this tale of courage and romance in the Colorado mountains. Please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 for more authentic frontier tales. Give this video a like if it touched your heart, and hit that hype button to help more people discover these stories of the American West. Until next time, partners.